once a week for the last 2 weeks, so barely getting started. Last week we did defunding the police and what does that look like, and it was just me and JP, and we brought some folks in as the conversation evolved. Today we are doing social work and policing, and this time we've got a bunch of social workers on here we are honored that decided to join us. And we'll go ahead and do a little introduction. So my name is Nikia Winfield. I'm a political social worker. I look at power dynamics and social systems. My lens comes from doing work with APD, specifically working with the Equity Office to get the Austin Police Department through the Equity Tool. We helped get their first 7 divisions through as a pilot. I've also been doing for this and for the work that I do yelling at the police. I've also gone on like 4 ride-alongs. I've gone to the Citizen Police Academy and just been really deep in the systems of like trying to figure out how to have accountability around police and policing. So if we want to go ahead and do some intros, let's go around the screen, my screen. Rachel, do you want to go ahead?
Sure, thank you. My name's Rachel Manning. I consider myself a macro social worker, or that's how I was trained in a community organizing program, actually. And I have worked in various aspects of the criminal legal system. I currently work in post-conviction capital work. So I do defense-oriented work with people who are incarcerated and with their families and communities. And that's a lot of the way that I think about these issues is how our policing and all of the systems that are attached to policing, how are those kind of operating in the communities that my clients and their families live in, and that's very much formed my view on these things. So yeah, I'm really, really happy to be here. So thank you all.
Thank you. Carrie Ann, can you tell them a little bit about your lens and your background on this?
Sure. My name is Carrie Ann. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. Wow, my lenses. I've actually developed a program within a police department. So I've worked as a social worker embedded in police departments before. I also come from the child protection system and the court social work system as well as psychiatric social work. I'm currently in academia. And so my lenses are, I say I use multiple lenses, but right now I'm doing a lot of work with law enforcement and social work. So that's where I am right now.
Thank you. Becca, you want to say something else?
And y'all describe what you do really well. So my name is Becca Hyatt, she, her pronouns. I work similarly to Rachel within the criminal legal system and defense-oriented social work, both when a client's legal case is open and afterwards, kind of in intensive case management for as long as the client needs. My clients are folks with serious mental illness in the criminal justice system. So my lens is kind of from the intersections of folks with serious mental illness, with the criminal legal system, and with homelessness.
Awesome, thank you so much. So first of all, we want to set the stage. Participants, we are definitely looking forward to a robust conversation. As you can see, we're all coming from different lenses. And we would love for you to engage in chat. If you've got questions, go ahead and put those in chat. If you've got observations or comments, go ahead and put those in chat as well. We'll have a natural conversation with the 4 of us, well, the 5 of us. Later on, we'll go ahead and bring y'all into the conversation if there are some questions that you have or some thoughts that you want to share with us, because the idea is that we want to be able to have this be engaging. Also, every once in a while, I'm going to switch out and look at the Facebook chat and see if there are questions over there, because last time we got a lot of them over there and we weren't able to bring those into discussion. So I guess first off, can you all talk a little bit about, like, when you think of social work and policing, what are the factors that you think are really important to be able to determine how that should look, and what your views are on that? Anybody?
Well, I'll go ahead and start. I think of the populations that I've served, particularly when we talk about domestic violence or sexual assault, or individuals who've experienced serious or vicarious trauma, and the first contact is a responder or law enforcement who aren't trauma informed. It tends to do a lot more harm, I believe, to the populations that we serve. And one of the things I've looked at in terms of training for law enforcement is just that lack of trauma, just that lack of trauma informed, and the lack of hours actually spending learning how to deal with various human behavior, as well as diverse populations. And so law enforcement comes in contact with marginalized populations on a daily basis, yet they receive the least amount of training in working with that population, as well as working with populations who've experienced a lot of trauma. So that's what comes into my mind.
Thank you. Becca, Rachel?
What comes to mind for me is how much it's changed in the past month. My lens of thinking about social work and police, and this narrative that we're getting asked all the time and people are bringing up all the time about kind of send in the social workers. And I want to make sure that I'm not just stealing so many things I've heard you say, Nakia, because you really changed how I think about this a lot. So I don't want to just steal your ideas. But just, initially when that was this kind of popular idea, when everyone's talking about defunding the police, like social workers, like we have the skills, training, and experience to de-escalate, to not use force, to try to, quickly build rapport and build trust and try to, not, if not indicated, not getting somebody involuntarily to a hospital and not to try to avoid jail. And with the knowledge that police officers can make people escalate further. And I was like, yeah, that's a great idea. We're great at that. And then between, some articles that you put out and some dialogues that I've seen, both that you've been in and some other social workers, that it's like, there is a lot to do before we just send in the social workers. And so I've had to take a step back and kind of understand as a social worker that works within criminal legal systems, how we ourselves are like participating and complicit, and and that there is systemic racism within social work. That's not really answering your question, and then just in terms of social work and police, just the way that I think about with my clients, that they are in crisis often, more often than not, the threat is to them and not to other people. That does happen at times, but the way that social workers kind of think about using police in interventions and rethinking that. And yeah, I'm kind of all over the place, but that's a start.
Thank you.
I guess I can jump in, and now I think I had an answer, and now I'm going in a lot of different places, but let's see if I can put something together. So I think that a lot of what Becca said about these, like, where the conversation has gone in the last month, 6 weeks, I think that's a huge deal, and we'll get to that. And I think part of what I think about is that so many social workers, in the way that we're trained, right, deal with individuals rather than systems, right? And so and that's a feature of, right, we deal with the person in front of us. We're trained in a medical model so often. And I think that's one of the things that comes up for me, that both like police or cops and social workers tend to deal with the individual in front of them rather than the systems thing. And I think that's one of the ways that social work, or parts of social work, could be a gift to this conversation, or could potentially make the conversation a lot worse, right? So can we bring the sort of big picture person and environment systems like informed conversation? Can we talk about trauma in the way that trauma impacts communities rather than just individuals, rather than just dealing with a medical model? And I'm not a clinician. So I think like most non-clinical social workers, I've always had a little bit of kind of defensiveness around having conversations about clinical versus non-clinical. And so, I learned how to fight for a macro lens when I was in graduate school. But I think bringing that into the conversation, right? How are we looking at systems and neighborhoods and communities and the structural part, and how social work can bring that lens to this conversation. Not entirely sure where I started or where I ended up, but I think I'm going to wrap up and see where we go next.
That's kind of perfect, Rachel, because that really, you touched on what was actually going to be one of my questions, one of my first questions that I wanted to offer. I'm just going to jump in here. But I think I was just thinking of the way I approach it. I'm not a social worker, definitely not a trained social worker, but I approach it from the lens of really realizing how much the nonprofit industrial complex and social workers have in common. That even historically speaking, we have really common roots that are very intertwined. And as a member of AJC, and we're now a nonprofit, although we're a nonprofit, we very much insist on seeing ourselves not as a nonprofit that needs to lead movements, but as a nonprofit that can support movements where change actually happens. But thinking about the connection between that and social work, I think back to the history all the way back to the early 19th century, in which this period that was called the progressive era, and you had these characters like Jane Addams and these different the settlement house movement. And it was interesting because you had these billionaires who were, on the one hand, invoking the police, calling on police forces, in the streets to massacre and murder workers, Black, brown, Latino workers, white workers who were fighting for their rights. And at the same time, these billionaires investing in what was the beginning of the so-called progressive era in the United States, investing in these social solutions that were very much based on social science, and sort of the driving force that brings these things together really are these white women who are at the helm of this movement. They're also suffragettes fighting for the right to vote, trying to claim space in the political sphere. And so they're taking social science, which is steeped in anti-Blackness, but bringing that anti-Black social science that attempts to produce social sciences and trying to figure out, okay, well, how do we fix these social problems? And the reason I go into that history is precisely because I think, and so from that period, that's where we get social work as a tradition in the United States. And that's also where we get these nonprofits funded by these donors. But the focus in both of those realms in different ways has been to either focus on individuals or to narrow in on aspects of the problem, implying that there are things about society that need to be redeemed, that need to be fixed, and that once we fix those things, once we heal those ugly social wounds, and we can use the language of kindness, we can use the language of therapy, we can use the language, but it all kind of falls into this strain of what historian Ibram Kendi calls the assimilationist strain in American history, where you have you have people who are pro-abolition, but they're not really anti-racists, so they're working on, well, how can we, it's this very paternalistic approach. How do we educate Black people? How do we train them? How do we get them to fit in? How do we make them adapt, and so that they can eventually reach the point in which they will be assimilated into this white normative society? So the question is, the question is really how, once we have that idea, once we see that, either as social movements, nonprofits that receive funding within the nonprofit industrial complex, or as social workers, how do we avoid the traps of looking at things as something that needs to be fixed, or looking at pieces of the picture, zeroing in on some social problems in a way that sort of ends up reinforcing or legitimizing systems of oppression?
Damn, JP,
Yeah, you were gonna just give us a little question right there.
Yeah, just real quick. I want to speak to a lot of like what you said and a lot of what everybody else said. And like I said, I'm hoping that this is just a dialogue and a conversation that goes off of what we've spoken about. So to respond to like what you just said, JP, I feel like one of the things about social work, the profession, is that we're very deeply institutionalized. We are working in systems to be able to support systems, and our role is very strongly as gatekeepers, right? Which is one of the reasons that I feel like social workers are so key to any sort of movement building, because we know what the systems are. Like we know what they are. Like we know how to navigate them. We know how they oppress people. We know how they crap on people, and they crap on us in the same way, right? And we also know our clients and what our clients' needs are. Like we're at this point that's like between institutions, that if we change our accountability from those institutions to the people that we're serving, like whole transformation can be happening with that, right? Like we are just very, very knowledgeable about like what are the outputs of these systems. And I think that like because we are so institutionalized, and a part of that institutionalization is the idea that the individual is the issue, right? Like the system is fine, the individual is the problem. And so we need to whip this individual into shape with like job programs and like, you know, maybe like a housing program. Like there's all these band-aids that we need to put on them to like get them into the shape that we want them to be in, so that we decide that they are worthy of being able to receive assistance, right? Or to be like included in like society in a way that's not shameful, or that includes dignity. And I feel like, again, if we can get social workers to like be able to be critical lovers of their systems, oh my God, right? Like the idea for me is that like, if you're looking at things on a systems level, like if your output is racist, your systems are racist. Like we have systems that create the outcomes that we are receiving. So like our systems are actively creating outputs that are racist. And if we're not going to look at changing those, then I feel like part of the conversation about like, let's just swap out social police officers for social workers, and they can be like the kinder, gentler cops. And if we're not doing the work of like analyzing our systems and figuring out how we are oppressing people without guns, right, by just using bureaucracy and like and rules and like all of these different things, then like I don't know that we're qualified to be able to do any of that work. There's more things that I want to say, but I feel like that was a lot, and I want to like open up the floor for people's thoughts. I'm gonna give it like 5 seconds and I'm gonna jump back in.
No, I mean, so this is something that I think about all the time, because I'm not in a social work role. That's not a qualification for my job. And so I think about it a lot as someone who kind of straddles both worlds, right? And the idea of a kinder, gentler cop, I think, is something that we should be thinking about, because it's not, that means we're not thinking about police, it means we're thinking about police and not policing, which is a shift that I've been thinking about a lot in the last couple of weeks, particularly as I work with a group of white folks I work with Undoing White Supremacy Austin locally. I'm sorry, I just had to plug that real quick. And one of the things we've been doing is talking about how are we policing each other in our day-to-day lives. And so it's in some way the act of policing, the act of fixing or modeling someone on an image of what does it mean to, as Nakia said, deserve dignity and deserve humanity. And so like, can we think about, rather than the cops as the people in the uniforms, but rather like the job that they do, and what does that job mean, and why do we need that job, and why would we put social workers as into that job of fixing other people into a model of like what it means to be human. And so I don't really know if that's where, but that's something that I'm thinking about a lot, because that definition of what it means to be human is based in white supremacy and patriarchy, right? And so if we aren't actively trying to like dismantle those things, and capitalism, and we're not going to be able to change policing, right? And I think that's something that we need to be thinking about a lot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I feel like one of the things, Carrie Ann, that you brought in. Also, does everybody see the questions in chat? Like, okay, like people have a lot of things.
Yeah, we might need to address some of these.
Yeah. So like, not that we have to talk about them right now. We're gonna get to them, but like, there's a lot of richness, and it's funny. I want to tell people. So before this call, they were like, "Oh yeah, this topic is much more narrow than defunding the police." Like, I don't know that we're gonna have that much to talk about, and I feel like that's being proven untrue. But I wanted to speak to Carrie Ann. You were doing work with domestic violence and sexual assault, and I feel like for the Austin Police Department. There's a group called Survivor Justice Project in Austin that has been really trying to get accountability around like our criminal justice system and like the way in which they treat survivors. And I remember when I was kind of engaged with them, one of the things that was happening is they were making demand on the police department, and the cops were like, no, come and see the people who are working on these cases. You know, they're really struggling, and they're not the enemy. And so they had council members, departments come to the offices that they were working in, and then come back to us and talk about like, oh, this is what we're seeing. They're not having a good time either. And so they talked about how when they went over there, the interview rooms, the walls for the interview rooms were so thin that you could hear everything that was happening outside the room, and everybody who was everybody who was outside the room could hear everything that's happening inside of the room. So there's no privacy, right? Like, what is that signal? Like, what is the value that signals when like a domestic violence, like a survivor is coming into this room, or a sexual assault survivor is coming into this room, like knowing that they need privacy, like they're having all of the shame, and knowing that everybody in the room can hear what they're talking about, right? And they talked about how like if you've got two of them, because there's at least two interview rooms, that like they might trigger each other if there's interviews that are happening at the same time, because like there's this like kind of cycle, right? And then you've got like the police officers themselves are like on calls to do follow-ups, but the way that their cubicles are set up is that there's no sound barrier. And so like you'll have one cop who's like asking a question, and then the person on the phone of the other cop is answering that question, because that's how close they are, right? And so I feel like when I'm thinking about policing overall as a culture, like these are people who are not, like, this is a system that does not value the experience of domestic assault survivors, right? Right? Like we have, I don't know how much tear gas and how much like, how many non-lethal weapons and all of this stuff that like we were willing to put resources towards like making sure that like cops are able to like tear gas people on the weekends, right? But like we're not willing to like just put in decent walling, right? For these things. And so like when you've got police officers that are in those systems, and I will say now that like I've been told that the rooms are different and they've got some walls and things, but like I'm sure that there are many more steps along the process of like domestic assault survivors in these systems that like that show that like we just don't care about you. Like we're just not going to have those resources here for you. Not only are we not going to train the police for that, but like even the social workers who are coming in the system, we're not going to pay them adequately, right? Like we're not going to allow them to inform what this system looks like in order to be able to like actually have a human-centered lens and to protect you from like after you've experienced this trauma. So I feel like when Rachel, when you're talking about the system of policing, like that's something that's really hard for me to be able to go, okay, like maybe there's something to work with. And so like, I guess, Carrie Ann, I'm asking, because I feel like you've done a lot of work in here, like how do you navigate around that? Like what does it look like as a social worker to come into that system? And do you feel like there's been attempts or like that there's been a possibility of changing any of that?
Right. So initially, when I first began at the police station, there was a lot of resistance. The police chief, this was his idea, and city council backed him. And so it was funded as a city police officer position. Mm-hmm. So that in itself had a lot of resistance from other police officers, because why are you paying a social worker when we could have just hired another cop? Right? And then it's like, she's going to mess up our case. Why is she here? But I would say, in all honesty, I worked with the department for 6 years, and it took 6 years to get the buy-in. By the time I was moving on to something else was when the peace officers really bought into the need for a social worker within the department. But what that process looked like was a lot of educating and a lot of me stepping back and observing what law enforcement really did, what was the role and what was their objective, and then really earning that trust to say, okay, this is what we can do better for the client, not necessarily for me or for you, but this is what this person needs. And oftentimes, and again, it took some time when that client really opened up to me, and then I think that the peace officer saw the value in partnership with the social worker, because oftentimes that victim of domestic violence, sexual assault, or it could even be it could even be a petty crime, felt more comfortable opening up to me because I used evidence-based tools in my questioning, in my discussion with them, and really just that empathy part, which I think, really a peace officer goes there to determine, has the law been broken? Is this an arrestable offense? The safety, is everyone safe? And then they're on their way. It's really not about the experience of that victim. So I would say what I saw, the position, the value of having a social worker within a police department is the experience for the victims. And it wasn't even victims. I had people who would come into the police department because they ran out of groceries and they just really needed somebody to talk to and wanted resources. And so the police department became a safe place for that community because they know that they could find a social worker within that police department. But I'll be very honest, Nakia, I wasn't ready to go out there with a gun and try to solve any crimes. I didn't get paid enough for that. I'm just being honest. So I wouldn't say defund the police, I would say reform the police and really use a systems approach, dismantle systems, right? And reform the systems in which we both operate, that is law enforcement and social work, and reform those systems to make it a little bit more livable for all of us, really.
I really appreciate your lens and like what you bring, because I feel like there's one, I feel like new information is always an opportunity to like level up, right? And to be able to like make sure that like what you're doing is on the right path, or to be able to correct that path, but like to be able to encompass this. And I feel like what you're talking about, like I definitely would not have imagined that people who don't have groceries would show up at APD or like any police station, especially considering the fact that like I am not interested in like if and I said this last time, like if something happened at my house, like the police are not the first people who I would call. They're not even the second or third people that I would call, right? Because I understand that like the racism that is within that system puts me directly in harm's way, right? Like I don't need that extra like stress on top of the fact that I've just been violated in some sort of way. But I feel like there's so many opportunities in what you're talking about to be able to have community stepping in to take care of community. Like if you're talking about like somebody that have groceries and they need somebody to talk to, like being able to like create relationships and like have like that creates resilience, like that actually like is better for your physical health and your mental health. And like what are ways that like we can have people like have places that they can go to get what they need that aren't actually dealing with a man with a gun in a really racist institution, right? And like there's so many ways I'm like, oh wow, like I didn't even think about that. That could be an amazing way. And I think that also one of the things that you said about like making it a little bit more livable, I feel like that's, and I'm not trying, like I'm coming up with the thoughts in my head, right? But I feel like JP, you and I talked about this idea of like how we are and how racism keeps us incremental, right? Like this idea of like, let's make it a little bit better and let's make it a little bit better. And like, let's make it a little bit less worse, right? And I feel like one of the reasons that I'm really hesitant to like bring social workers in as like a trading with the cops or partnering is that institutionalization makes it so we can't imagine a whole different future, like a whole different future. Like if you're talking about a domestic assault survivor or a domestic abuse survivor, and like we have a system that is specifically geared towards them, that it has to do with community, that has to do with like restorative justice, that has to do with figuring out like what is it that you need and how can we get it to you, like has to do with like a completely imagine a different view of like what public safety is, right? And like how are you leaning on your neighbors to be able to continue to be safe in this time when you are seriously trauma, not just a trauma informed police officer, but like peer support specialists that are able to come in and go like, hey, I've had this happen too. Like people being able to like to build that person up with a mental health knowledge, and not just one where it's like, okay, but this is how these systems are, and like we're going to be able to come back and come, this is how you can use these systems, this is what you can cut off of yourself to be able to go through this system, instead of like this is how the system can like completely change to serve you. Sorry, that was a lot, but I could feel I want to hear other people's thoughts about what's up.
JP, do you want to jump in?
I have to say, but you go first.
Okay, so I had so many feelings come up, Carrie Ann, when you talked about the groceries. And most of my feelings are actually, it's something that I talk about in work a lot, is like, where are the failures in our system, right? Like, where are the failures in our system that cause these things to happen? And how, what a tragedy it is that the police are also a problem for food insecurity, or a solution for food insecurity, right? Like, what kind of world are we creating here when the cops who are inherently violent, right? The cops are purveyors of violence. They carry guns on their belt and they carry batons, right? Like, they're there to deal with the last possible, like, ideally, right? The last possible moment in which community support fails. And I don't even really think that, I don't think they should exist, but like how many problems have we created in our society that groceries are solved with a gun and a baton? And so when I think about policing, and I think about like all of the tiny things that cops are here, like cops are like our antidote to poverty for some reason now, right? Like as if like cops are supposed to deal with crimes of poverty, right? I remember from, most women who are incarcerated for crime, like economic crimes, right? Theft and things like that. So these are crimes of poverty. Most crime is crime of poverty, or crime, or trauma, right? You can kind of break it into two things, and also, poverty is trauma. So like, why are we dealing at the last possible minute? Why aren't we dealing on the beginning? Why aren't we dealing with things at the beginning? Why is it so hard for someone to get groceries that we go to the cops? I'm just having like all of these feelings about where things could be fixed beforehand if we didn't have, 40% of our budget, just speaking in terms of like Boston right now, if all of our funds weren't being directed to the police station, what would we possibly be able to build? Like, what are the possibilities that are within that if we actually started addressing social problems in a different way?
Yeah.
So yeah, so many feelings.
Yeah. So how about like multidisciplinary teams, right? And so if somebody has contact with law enforcement and it is not a case that is criminal in nature, then there's some social services where crimes can be prevented, where we can actually help individuals rather than a situation getting to the point that it is so bad that someone feels that they have to come to the police for groceries, right? That we have these resources readily available. And I think even more so if, and this is my lens. I was a guardian ad litem for a number of years and a CPS supervisor. So looking at the lenses, I have always worked with law enforcement for the past 20 years. And I've seen the good and I've seen the bad and I've seen the really ugly. And I feel in the world that we live in today that is so polarized with race, the racial tension right now, and we know that we're living without systems that are not going to be easily dismantled. No matter how much we talk about it, it's not something that's going to happen overnight. But what we can do is small systemic changes such as multidisciplinary teams, social services partnering with law enforcement, and really taking care of our communities, like you said, Rachel, before it gets to law enforcement, that we have those resources in place. And someone said something about the budget. Why is 40% of the budget going towards law enforcement? And can some of that budget be diverted to social services within that? If it has to go to the police department, then how about we have a unit that's a social services unit? And then that way you can justify 40% of that budget and that social services. So like, let's say if you have a juvenile who comes in and that juvenile was stealing, I don't know, whatever it was. And the reason is because, and I'm saying this because I've seen it. I have seen mothers arrested at Walmart stealing formula or diapers. Okay, so instead of arresting, there's a social services unit where we say, okay, this is the reason that this is happening. We can divert this family. But then you have a system that's able to take care of that immediately. I guess I'm thinking in a Pollyanna type of frame because, and because I'm looking for solutions. And that's me. I'm very solution focused when it comes to dismantling systems. So what can we do so that we can help our communities?
Yeah. Sorry.
Go on, Becca.
I think that's brilliant, and I love that you're bringing that perspective here, Carrie, because that allows us to really have exactly the kind of conversation that we're trying to have here on Wednesdays. And I feel like my job is also to provoke and to challenge people to really. I think we're all doing that in our own way, but to really challenge people to allow themselves to imagine beyond, right? So the challenge of imagining a world without police is really to go a step beyond that, and it's interesting because when we're caught in this space of working with people, of helping people, there is this problem of like, well, I have this immediate problem, I have this immediate crisis that needs to be solved, and who do I turn to, right? Today, tomorrow, this week, to deal with this immediate crisis that I'm facing. But then at some point, we have to also be able to pause and ask. And the kind of neoliberal economic order that we're in is just successfully dismantled so many of our social institutions and continues to dismantle social institutions. And all the while, the police are the institution that grows, right? Policing is always allowed to just grow and swallow that space. It's interesting. I'm from Latin America, and in Chile, when the sort of neoliberal economic order was introduced under Pinochet's Chile, and you had these American Friedmanite economists who helped Chile restructure their economy. Their advice to the Chilean government was, brutal austerity, //////. I think this is something that Naomi Klein describes in The Shock Doctrine. But the one thing they didn't say to slash was police. Because if you're going to slash everything else, then you need to grow the.
Yeah.
As we kill all of our other social institutions, the police start to grow, and that's how you have this 40% of the budget being the police, because they just swallow more and more and more of our society. So that's one thing I wanted to offer. And so at some point, we have to realize, okay, working with the police or being in the police at all, how does that just effectively contribute to this growing beast that's slowly swallowing everything? And if we want funding and investments to go into other places, at what point do we start to pull away from our entanglement in this thing, because or else it will continue to swallow us, right? We will have police in our living rooms, police, like it's coming. It already is here, really, and we're going, and the kind of logic of, this is entirely language that I learned from Black woman abolitionists, but, the idea that we live in what is and slavery are the sort of paradigms that govern what we are, as a nation, and how all of our democratic institutions work. So to think beyond that, it takes some work. But if we don't, I think that we're going to have more and more and more of the movement in the other direction. And the last thing I wanted to say for now to this point is that also, I lost my train of thought. So I might have to come back again. Yeah, wow. It just escaped me at this very minute. So just, I was going to point out the way in which policing has grown to fill the space of the neoliberal, sorry, I remembered it. Thank you. Thank you guys for bearing with me. You mentioned, Carrie Ann, the sort of the good police for the, the moments in which it happens that a police officer, are you guys losing me?
Yeah, you keep breaking in and out.
Am I here now?
Yes.
You are for a moment, yes.
Okay, sorry.
No.
So Carrie Ann, you mentioned the good, the bad, and the ugly in policing, and sort of living with police through all of it, right? Through the moments when you happen to see a police officer have a really kind of humane interaction with a person, and that really nice moment, or that okay moment at least. And then the moments that seem like police officers are maybe doing something that they're not supposed to be doing, but it's complicated, right? The bureaucracies of being inside the police department. And then those terrifying moments when all of a sudden you have this outburst of police violence. And so the interesting thing about putting those three moments together is it makes it look like, well, it all comes together, right? We have to sort of live with all of this. A police force. But the challenge that I want to offer, if my internet doesn't completely die on me here and kick me out of this conversation, the challenge that I want to offer is that it may be, in fact, that those three instances are three completely different things. Mm-hmm. That what happens when a police officer is being friendly with the community, playing soccer with the children, doing community outreach, or helping a mother, or helping a person who has suffered domestic violence. What happens in those instances is completely external. It's superfluous to what the police actually are. It so happens to be that in certain instances, police officers do all these other things because police officers are still human. Mm-hmm. But the institution that they're in is fundamentally about administering and controlling state violence. That's the but I'm going to stop talking here because I think my internet is disastrous and I don't want to kill this conversation.
Becca.
Yeah. Y'all have said so much good stuff, and so I have ooh, I feel like I have something to add, and then y'all will say a million more good things. So I'll try to have a clear thought. And then my friend / colleague just commented something. We spoke before getting on this call. A few things come up. One of them is that I think as social workers and all of us as players within these systems, so much we recognize is real. Can we swear?
Oh, yeah.
It's so much that we recognize is really fucked up, but we just accept it as truth. And that's it's just we'll say oh, it's Texas. Oh, it's the criminal legal system in Texas. Oh, it's mental health in Texas. And so, the fact that sometimes I feel quite relieved when one of my clients that has been MIA and I'm really concerned for their health and well-being, when I see that they get arrested, I'm relieved. I'm like, well, they're going to get some treatment there. They're not going to get treatment. And the fact that I'm comfortable enough with that at this point, and I'm not pushing back on systems, and that we just understand the reality that the jails and prisons in the entire country, and particularly in Texas, are the #1 provider of mental health treatment, particularly for poor and indigent folks. So it's like, in terms of how we, within our roles of social workers and intersecting disciplines, can try to be a part of shifting the system while also trying to do better, is not just accepting those things as truths, and figuring out how we, whether it's within our role, within my role, I can't do much, but extracurricularly I could, and it's like, building coalition with other folks that understand the systems because we operate within them, oftentimes in problematic ways. How can we use what we know, use what we've experienced, and try to push for systems change, even if it's not, greenlit by the organizations that we work for. What was the other thing? Oh, and then so another thing coming up, and so Melissa just commented this, is that I'm like really annoyed with all of these infographics that are circling around as like alternatives for calling the police. And I like end up being the fuck boy that shows up in comments like, actually, but like, it's like, if somebody's in a mental health crisis, call this. If somebody is having a domestic violence issue, call this. If somebody, if there's a homeless person that you would have otherwise called 911, and then the information that is so often shared is literally, that's not how it works. We don't have alternatives to police right now. And so sharing this, like sharing those things creates this false sense that we can just defund the police and that we have what we need already. And it's like organizations aren't totally transparent about what they can actually do. And I think that like transparency and what the scope of different service organizations is such an important step, because it's not, the organizations are all good for the most part, or they're, most of them, most of these organizations are well-meaning and have a good mission statement. And it's not because they don't want to do more. It's a lack of funding. It's a lack of support. It's, again, putting too much into policing versus into social services. More needs to be on the front end before things are actually a crisis. What does that look like? Community mental health. What does that look like? Housing. What does that look like? And so organizations need to be transparent about what they can provide. And we need to be transparent with the community that, like, if you are scrolling through one of these infographics and it's like, okay, 911, it's the responsible thing to do to not do that, and call a number, and you get a program that's saying like, oh, we are an existing program, you have to be in our services. That's not going to help anyone. And create a false sense that we have what we need when we don't.
Yeah, there's so much with this conversation. So much. And I want to bring in some of the questions that we've got from the audience. So are y'all all able to see the actual Q&A, or are you only seeing the questions in chat? You can see the Q&A.
So I'm looking at both. I actually kind of, can I respond to Becca and try and answer one of these questions?
Yeah.
So I've been looking at this panel and thinking about how wonderfully curated this is as far as like social workers who work within this system, right? I was like, oh, we all work within systems that at least directly intersect with the police, right? And what a small section of the social work field that is, right? And how we all do, but the broader world of social services. And so I'm seeing a lot of like comments about the Department of Family and Protective Services or other like ways in which people are social workers and also intersecting with the police or policing, both things, right? Someone brought up code enforcement as a form of policing, and I just wanted to like jump up and down with joy. Whoever did that, I love you. So just kind of thinking about like, okay, we need these institutions, right? I actually texted Nakia yesterday because a friend had texted me and said, hey, there's a Black homeless woman in my front yard right now who is definitely having a mental health crisis. And I don't want to call the cops. And I was like, yeah, that's kind of too bad, because there really isn't much of anything else. And we tried for a couple hours and then, and everything was fine, right? It was one of those like good policing moments, right? But it wasn't a good policing moment. It was just like a human interaction that didn't go terribly wrong, but the potential for it to go terribly wrong was there. And so how do we create these new institutions that serve these functions that we need as a society without making them white supremacist, patriarchal, capitalistic, violent institutions, which I think is something that Christelle asked right at the beginning when she's like, how do you work within an institution that is inherently racist without recreating that system? And so like, and you can't, it's like, it's a really horrible bind to be in. And so I'm just kind of thinking about like this catch we're in right now, where we want the new systems, but in order to be doing that work, we need to be actively undermining or actively like undoing these like big systemic things. I'm not sure if that was what I intended to do, but I'm just kind of looking at like all of the different ways that, oh, it's actually because I wanted to talk about social work and means testing and the shitty hoops that we make families jump through in order to access services, and how fucked up social services are, and how that is also a form of policing. But I think I'll just kind of leave that one for now.
I wanted to bring in anonymous attendees question, which kind of speaks a little bit about what you're talking about with ethics. So like, we already have social workers in many police departments, and there was even a case of a Black social worker being shot by police in the not so distant past while trying to protect his autistic client. Our ethical code seems at ends with the institution of policing. And at what point do we need to accept that our values do not align with the values of policing as an institution? Is that time not now? And I feel like one of the questions, or one of the things about this question is something that keeps coming up for me about like, our ethics give us these mandates about like not creating harm, right? Our ethics have a lot of like different like sections and whatnot. It's not just don't create harm, but like, how are we, is it possible for us to work within these systems and still honor the code of ethics that we have as social workers, knowing that these systems are having racist outcomes? Also, somebody in the Facebook questions was asking like for an example of an outcome that's racist for the systems. So if you've got, so when we're talking about systemic outcomes, like for policing or criminal justice, if like the easiest one is that like Black folks and white folks use marijuana at the same rates. But like when you look at arrest rates, when you look at conviction rates, when you look at all of the problems where you have the fallout of criminal justice, Black people are disproportionately represented, right? Even though you've got the same crime, which we can debate whether that's a crime or not in a different call, but like that you have very disproportionate outcomes that are specifically worse for Black people than they are for any other point in the system. And you can see that with hospitals, you can see that with maternal mortality rates, you can see that with the COVID outcomes. So on all across the board, on all levels, like our systems are racist. And so I guess that also brings a broader question. So there's policing, right? Where we're like, you all have racist outcomes, like point blank period, right? More than almost any other system. But like, those are also the same outcomes for education. And those are the same outcomes for food justice and all these other systems where social workers are also working in, right? So like, what are the ways in which we're able to like, to honor the ethics that we have, the ethical code that we are bound by for our profession, and be able to continue doing this work? No answers, just questions.
Nikia, do you want to try to bring in a few people to ask their questions, or how?
Let's oh wow. Yes, let's answer this one and then start bringing folks on. And I feel like some of the people who have been asking questions in chat, it might be great if they would be able to like just jump on. So do y'all have thoughts about our ethical responsibilities in these systems?
Carrie, I'm gonna go.
You can go, Becca. You know, I have thoughts, but I'm just gonna wait. Becca,
I mean, I feel like short answer, as it exists now, we can't fully, you know, and I think that the most ethical thing that we can do is try to work within our code and within our understanding of ethics and anti-racist practice, and then try to push the needle within the system to make it so the work that we do can be more ethical in terms of, like, again, our code of ethics, but then just generally our understanding of being anti-racist social workers. And, I think, in previous conversations, having the conversation about the industrial systems or industrial complex rather, and that it doesn't just limit to the things that we think of that are just like everybody can understand that they're violent or bad, like the military or the police or the criminal industrial complex. It also extends to things like the medical industrial complex, the mental health industrial complex, like JP, as you mentioned, nonprofit industrial complex, like rethinking these things that we've thought of as good and helpful, and that well-meaning people really do often enter them for good reasons, and then become just responsible because you're an employee. And so you become responsible to the system, and then you become complicit within it while trying to do the best work that you can. And so as of right now, I think that the systems, particularly when we're talking about profit being involved, that they're set up that there's no way to be a truly ethical practitioner existing within any of those systems.
I agree with that.
Kind of like there's no ethical consumption under capitalism, right? Like there's no ethical working under capitalism either.
Yeah. And also, I mean, go ahead, JP. You and I are going to just do this, aren't we? So something about the code that I like to hold is that it's aspirational, right? A code is something that it's very real and we can hold ourselves to it, but it's also a document that says these are our values, right? Like it's and so something that I think about is just making those, talking about those values, right? Okay, so actually use the code. Sit down and say where, treat it like courts do laws. Is this within our code? Does this actually work? Use it as an actual document to hold ourselves to the decisions we make. Because if we're not going back and we're saying, does this fall within the code? Is this actually something that falls within the code? If we're just saying the code, blah, 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 we all know what it means. But if we're not using it, use it or don't, right? But if you're not going to use it, then we don't get to say, oh, we have a code. And so it's one of the things that I really love about social work is that it does have a set of really radical values, actually. I think part of the way that we can get better is we can actually use we can actually use it as a tool to get ourselves to a better place. I don't know. That's just kind of my thought at the moment.
I really like a distinction that I learned from Joy James that the government can't free people, right? It's a complete mistake, for instance, to say Lincoln freed the slaves, right? Lincoln didn't free the slaves. He signed an Emancipation Declaration, which is very different. This law, the legal systems can allow for emancipation. They can undo a legal slavery that they legally created, but freedom comes from people who are oppressed. They have to construct their own freedom. They win their own freedom. They build and fight for their own freedom. So there isn't a top-down solution that gives people freedom. I feel like, at AJC, our role is in a lot of ways to just sort of step back and support people and movements. And we realize this increasingly, support the people and the movements that are pushing forward and fighting for their own freedom at this time, as opposed, and I feel like that's really an important distinction, right? So we're not going to create systems that are going to emancipate people. People are going to come in. We're not going to create systems that are going to free people. People are going to come in and build and fight for their own freedom. That's the only way they're going to get it. So.
Nikki, you're muted.
Yeah, thanks. One of the things that makes me think of is when we were starting to go around and talk about social work and policing. One of the things that I think of about social workers is in the 60s during the civil rights movement, right? And like the idea of who you were as a social worker was a community organizer. Like these are people who know and understood the systems and were like interested in liberation, right? Liberation of poor people, liberation of Black people, liberation of all people, right? And how we have now gotten co-opted into like being gatekeepers of those systems that we were like supposed to be originally rebelling against, and how that's happened so often, and so many of the things that like we have created for resilience get co-opted and then like get gate kept so that they are now serving these systems. And I'm just thinking about like in the 60s, if you were talking about social workers and collective liberation, what you weren't talking about is holding hands with the police, right? Like it was very clear that like police were like the arm of like white supremacy that was going to come in to fuck your shit up, right? Like they're going to come in and like shoot and kill Fred Hampton, right? Like they're going to come in and like try to undermine and destabilize your movements and your push for freedom. And I think that it's really like, so, to me, social work, and I feel like this is one of the things where I'm like, this is why I can't be like, social workers should do this stuff, because I'm thinking about like my friends who are the social workers who are all like, yeah, no, we can't do that, right? Who are more aligned to this idea of like, the police are the people who are going to come in, who are going to be the arms of the system that keep the status quo that we are fighting against, versus now, like there's so many systems that we are so institutionalized and embedded in that like that's just a natural hand holding, right? Like there's a natural way in which like, oh, okay, well, we need to be interacting with these clients, and like the policing is the only institution that was continued to be funded, and all of the rest of these systems were depleted to be able to actually help people who needed help. And so like they're our last hope. And so like as social workers, we're like, okay, well, I guess if this is the system that's doing things, then I guess those are the folks that we have to work with. And I guess if they've got outcomes that are racist, if they're actively creative harm, then like we're going to be there to like prevent that. We're going to come in and we're going to be like, hey, I'll be here, and so the system will do less harm than it would if I wasn't here. And I feel like there's how are we? I feel like the only way in which we are able to be ethical in the systems is to go in with the mindset of like, yes, I'm going to change this system, and also be accountable to community on the outside and be in real regular contact, because otherwise those institutions will change us, right? Like when we're like, I'm going to come in and I'm going to change this institution, like you're going to try, but like institutions, like specifically institutions are known for like being resistant to change, right? Like that's what they're here for. And so I feel like that's one of the ways that we are able to go in, and that we're able to like kind of infiltrate and get information back out to be able to like do that organizing work. And so if we can get social workers to be community organizers again, like I might have some different ideas about what's up. Carrie Ann, do you want to say some things to this before we open up and bring some folks in?
No, I mean, I totally agree. And in reference to our code of ethics, I think, and Nakia, a lot like you, when I think, yeah, we can do this, I'm thinking about my friends, right? And my colleagues that I work in close proximity to, that I know are culturally competent, have diverse experiences, and, you know, boots on the ground type of macro and micro social workers. But unfortunately, that's not our entire profession. And so one of the things that I think even our system and in dismantling our own system is that we have to we have to take a close look at our code of ethics and see how does it hinder or how does it actually help the populations that we work with. Maybe it needs to be overhauled. Maybe it needs to to be taken a look at as well. And then how do we work within those ethics to help our populations? And I think it was Rachel who says it's quite challenging, because we tend to perpetuate those very systems we're trying to help our clients with. And so it's really a catch-22, I find. And so I think my stance, my lens is on both systems, whether it is social services or law enforcement. We need to look at a reform of both, because essentially they're both still gatekeepers. That's what we're doing. We do a lot of fancy work, but at the end of the day, we have to follow the laws of the land and be gatekeepers. And so I think we have to take different approaches, like JP was saying, and probably just, topple the whole apple cart and start over.
Yeah.
How do we do that, right? And so my thing is the how. How do you do that? How do we work within the systems that we have? Can there be a world without law enforcement? I don't know. We have to think of, why was law enforcement created to begin with?
Oh, yes, we do.
That predates slavery, right? And so when we think about the different gangs of New York, we think about the Irish population, we think about, different populations who have come into America and how they were governed and how they were policed compared to African Americans, compared to Hispanic. JP, I see you're from Chile, I'm Dominican. And so we have different lenses. You're from Peru, I'm sorry.
Brazil.
Oh, Brazil. Okay, I just completely messed you up. Forgive me. And so I just think of all the different lenses in which, and then having worked with law enforcement, I have an idea of how it can be, but I also know the systems within which I have to work and manage my license. I have been a court social worker, so I've seen that mess. And how do you deal with that, right? And so I'm not too sure how we can work within the current ethics, within the current laws given. We have to somehow come to a solution as to what would reform look like. And if there is a world without police, without law enforcement, then who is going to do that hard work? Because it is going to be hard. And then we have to identify, again, why was law enforcement created?
Mm-hmm. Beautiful questions. Do we want to let's bring another person in? Let's bring some folks in. I feel like this is such a good conversation. So Matt Dietrichson, are you down to come through? Also, if you're interested in coming through, yep, you are. Okay, great. Let me. I've never done this before. I feel like I'm drunk with power.
Bring him into the room.
He's got some questions in chat. If you want to come on in, if you want to turn your camera on, you're welcome to. And join us for a sec. You don't have to, you're also, you're muted right now. So come on in.
Boom. Oh, hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Hey, what's up? Thanks for doing this, y'all. Exciting, interesting stuff. A couple of different thoughts that came up for me. I posted that one comment just about kind of just the trauma that's baked into the role of being a police officer. Is a perspective I hadn't really thought much about until recently. I was working with a police officer doing a retired officer doing therapy with them, and then when we think about how trauma begets trauma, and I'm curious kind of to carry on with you how much you worked in that directly with officers, and the culture is one in which if you talk about your feelings, you're unfit for duty, and then you're not. So I don't know what the answer is there. I just think that is when we talk about in the long run, how do we reform what policing looks like? I think that has to be addressed in some degree. And then I have another thought, but that was one thing. I just wanted to put that out there.
Okay. Well, Matt, and so when I worked for the 6 years I worked with law enforcement, I was on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 6 years. And that, so if something happened at 2 o'clock in the morning, I went out with law enforcement 2 o'clock in the morning. I had a body cam, just like a police officer. And I went into the homes with them as well. I did death notifications. I went to suicide. I even went to some SWAT calls. And I'm by the time I left, I had police officers who would knock on my office door and close the door and said, I just need to talk. I just need to dump. And so we built a relationship of trust. And like I said, it didn't come easy, right? Because I don't wear a badge. And so I was met with a lot of resistance. But I can say by the end of it, that's the relation, and that's the relationship I have with them today. If something happened, they will call me, hey, can we talk? And just dump. But again, that came with building a relationship. Will that happen in every police department? I don't know. And again, this was a smaller department where I was intentional in building a relationship, right? And so that was my experience. Everybody's not going to have the same experience. And yes, I saw a lot of trauma, a lot of vicarious trauma on both sides. I saw law enforcement officers who sat with a dead baby bawling. So I've seen both.
I do want to say that we are going to have one of our, not next week, but the week after that, we're going to have the topic be trauma in policing. And so that is the things that we are going to be discussing
cool.
at that one as well.
Cool. Well, that was just another thought. And then the other thing that I really wanted to give a shout out to, I think it was Rachel was speaking to the relatively radical code of ethics we have that we may or may not all try to live up to as social workers. And I just wanted to note that there are some movements within our profession, some folks up in Chicago trying to just building more labor power and educating our profession, but then also there's some of that happening down here in Austin. And I just linked a little petition to the NASW to actually try to address kind of the carceral kind of more of the racist and unethical policing stuff. So maybe we can see some of this. I don't know. We'll see. Yeah. Go team.
Thank you. Y'all, is there anybody else who is looking like you want to invite them in? The questions. Also, since Matt almost said it, but then didn't quite, there is a social workers union here in Austin who is connecting with Chicago and who is trying to connect with NASW to see like how we can be a little bit more radical and go back to kind of that community organizer sort of lens and like really looking at workers' rights. And so they're doing some really great work. They're still in their infancy, but you should absolutely take a look and join them if you feel so called. Anybody else want?
No, I just wanted to say, I mean, we've kind of touched in the last couple minutes on organizing a couple times. And, I think Becca was talking about it and then Nakia explicitly said it and then Matt said it. And so like, what does it look like to organize social workers and whether that's like, better better conditions for us in our work and like also, but also like, what are the ways in which we can leverage our, the fact that we are in so many different places and we have so much access. And like Nakia was saying right at the beginning, like we're in all of these institutions. And so we have so much knowledge about what goes on and how things actually work. And so I went to social work school in New York. And so I came here from there and there was so much kind of, so many conversations that happened between social workers in the city. And I haven't seen that happen as much here in Texas. It's also just, it's a really different place, but how can we be more organized to create a better world for the communities that we work with and the individuals within those communities?
Yes.
Care for it.
Somebody asked for the link for the Social Workers United, and I'm trying to find it. But is there another person that we want to bring on? I feel like some of these questions, maybe Corey Toland. Is Corey, if you're still here and you want to come on, do you want to put your hand up? Oh, also you can raise your hand by going into, oh, how do you do it? I forgot. Now I'm drunk with power and I don't know how to do it anymore. Do you remember how to raise your hand? I think you do it under panelists. No, under participants. And then like you've got an option to raise your hand over there.
I don't know. I'm not the Zoom expert here.
It's cool.
Yeah.
Well, I don't even know if Corey is still here. Corey is still here. Corey, do you want to come on?
At the bottom of the screen. I think, isn't there a little hand icon at the bottom of the screen?
Right. I think there's supposed to be an icon that says reaction and I don't see it. It was probably disabled.
Oh, that's funny. So Corey, it looks like, oh, one call in this room. Okay, we're gonna allow to talk.
Corey's raising their hand. If you go from panelist and go over to the other tab, I can't do anything about it, but.
We get Corey in.
Corey?
Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Oh, great. Hi, I'm Corey.
Hi.
I just want to, again, thank everyone. I really liked the discussion. It was very fruitful, and I feel like there was a lot of different perspectives. And I just kind of wanted to touch base. I think you all talked about it at the beginning, but how social work and policing kind of interact in other ways that aren't just law enforcement, and especially kind of how society has almost weaponized DFPS, which is Department of Family Protective Services, and how Black families are really torn apart at much higher rates than white families are, and removed, and really like how that just perpetuates racial trauma. And how do we as social workers address that in the systems?
It's a great question. Anybody have some answers y'all want to talk about? Becca, I see you came off of mute.
I didn't do that on purpose, actually.
Oh, okay.
It is definitely not my area of expertise, DFPS, at all.
I mean, I think so. I know that Joyce James, who is amazing, did a lot of work with CPS and helped to create SEED, which is what was the Center for the Elimination of Disproportionality and Disparities, and did a lot of work bringing Undoing Racism in to help to help social workers be able to understand where their power was. So what would happen is like social workers would get calls from particular neighborhoods, and they would just already have the car seat in the back, because if they were from that neighborhood, the idea was like they're going to remove this child from this family. And when having the conversations in Undoing Racism with social workers, they didn't feel like they had any power. They were like, oh, we don't have any power. This is what we have to do. We have to do these things. And when you talk to families who are in some real fucked up situations, and who might have their kids taken away, like, do you think that they think that social workers have power? Absolutely. Like, you literally have the power to take my child away from me, right? And so like being able to, so with the work that she did, she changed CPS and the outcomes of CPS so much that they used it around the US and called it the Texas model. And I was like, whoa, Texas did something right, get it? Which is why we don't have the Center for Elimination for Total Disproportionality and Disparities anymore, because Texas is real intent on not getting shit right. But like with this widespread knowledge of like systems analysis and being able to go, okay, like we are now agents in our systems, like we are going to come through with a community organizing lens. We are going to have change and have our accountability towards the people that we're serving, and not necessarily this system that is like actively creating harm with what it's doing. I feel like that was something that was really, really amazing. And if it hadn't happened, if there wasn't like record of this, I would not believe that it could have happened in Texas, because that's not where Texas's values are, as far as I'm concerned. But I feel like if we're able to have a widespread lens shift, especially for social workers, like we are so key in these systems. And if we can just, again, become community organizers, like lean into anti-racism, if we can get anti-racist social workers, if that can be something that's synonymous, we can do a whole lot of things, even with the systems as terrible as they are right now.
And Nikia, if I might jump in here real quick.
Yeah.
Your answer also kind of, it reminded me of a question, a point that was made by someone in the chat, who noted that systems are people. I believe it was Sue Brooks. She said, systems are people. And I think it's an interesting point that we hear a lot of. And I think, yes, systems are made up.
No, JP, come back.
Oh, no.
I hear, is there any hope?
Yes, okay, you're back.
There's hope.
You want to just skip me? Skip me.
Put whatever you're going to say in chat, because I feel like it was going to be beautiful. I feel like JP always says beautiful things.
I'm sad, but it sucks. Sorry, guys.
I mean, like, I feel like the idea of systems as people is like real clear. And I feel like there's so one of the things about like Donald Trump being president, and Lauren, sorry for bringing this shit up, is that like early on, I was like, if we all just agreed, like our reality is just a shared version of like what we all agree on is happening. And if we just all agreed that like this man wasn't our president and somebody else was our president, that would be our new reality. Right? Like that would be what was happening. And so like we are also all part of systems as well. Like we are part of like the governmental system, like and the democratic system of the United States. And if we did have like a different view on things, like we could make some changes. But the likelihood is that everybody's not going to be like, yep, that's what happened. As much as I would like them to, as much as like I feel like we all need to have that shift, right? But like, so systems are people, but people are also systems, and systems are also really, really strong and kind of dictate what it is we do. But I think that it's so important to be able to understand that like our group dynamic is made up of individuals, and like how we are able to change things is able to change the world. Carrie-Ann, you look like you were about to say a thing.
No, I think I was just waiting for JP's statements. I'm hoping that he writes it in the chat so we can read what he has to say. But I would concur with you, Tori, in terms of a disproportionate amount of African-American children do come into care. And I would say that is nationwide. When I lived in Alaska and I practiced there, it was the Native Alaska population and our Indian children that came into care at a disproportionate rate there. And that was even when you had social workers who were Black and even Native American. And so again, is really understanding the systems. And again, like you said, Nakia, being gatekeepers, we tend to perpetuate the stereotypes within those systems. And like you said, Joyce did amazing work here in the state of Texas that has been replicated. And essentially that's what we have to do. We have to go within our communities and really understand kinship care and understand our populations, right? And then really truly be embedded in those populations in order for us to make a difference. But thanks for bringing that point up, Corey.
So we've got Sarah, who I think has their hand raised. I'm gonna bring on Corey. Okay, how do I do these things? Sorry. Oh, there goes Corey.
You're doing a great job.
Thank you. Oh, okay.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So yeah, I just want to thank y'all for hosting this space this time to talk about dismantling violence. Yeah, and I, am currently struggling with advocating for clients of mine who are experiencing what I understand as like anti-Black implicit bias within medical systems. In particular, I'm seeing it happening a lot with emergency psychiatric services. And there's, some different studies that show that Black folks are disproportionately accessing emergency psychiatric services through the police and are not accessing it through the emergency mental health services that we're needing to have in those situations. And so, and so when I guess I've been confronted with these situations of anti-Black implicit bias, I've struggled with, I think, and part of it is due to the work, right? Because of HIPAA and because of, other issues, it can be hard, I think, to maybe elevate these situations in an organizing framework. And so I was wondering if any of y'all have suggestions for community partners that are, additional advocates, especially for social workers who find themselves maybe as the sole advocates for these folks who are facing very dire situations and, are in perhaps like complex systems where having just one person who is, actively advocating for them may not be enough.
So you said a lot of things, and I just want to like narrow
Sorry.
down. No worries. So you're looking for like where are sources in the community to be able to help to advocate for mental health, and maybe some sources for mental health services that aren't participating in anti-Blackness. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, and sorry, it was like a lot of unloading, but yeah, more than happy to help with clarification if folks had other questions. But yes, thank you, Nakia, for making that into a nice little peanut.
I feel like Becca, I saw you nodding your head a lot. I don't know if you have thoughts.
I have a lot of thoughts. I think, and this isn't helpful for you, it sounds like you're looking for to kind of brainstorm what some solutions might be for things that, and I hate to say this, it doesn't exist. And so, I was having like our community mental health system as it exists for indigent folks, folks with Medicaid, folks with MAP, folks without insurance, there's just not enough. It's really, I handhold sounds really patronizing, but I accompany clients through the mental health systems as like a very significant part of my job. And I'm not here to say anything negatively about particular agencies, but I had the conversation with my boss and friend prior to this conversation, kind of brainstorming some things that could be talked about. And we were talking about, if I was having a mental health crisis or a loved one of mine was having a mental health crisis, or let's talk about prior to that, right? Like wanting to avoid getting to the place of a crisis. Like if feelings were starting to feel like pre-crisis, I was like, I need more than I have right now, more than my regularly scheduled appointments. I have a therapist. I have an employee assistance program. Like I have an EAP. And so like, I have all these things that I can do first. And then, and then I have a lot of people in my life that know different resources. And so I have so many safeguards in place prior to needing to like call 911 or any kind of like what we would call crisis services to try to avoid crisis. Outpatient behavioral health in our community and crisis services in our community just don't have enough resources. And that's not because they're bad or don't want to. It's just there's so much red tape. And so again, that's not helpful for you because it sounds like you're trying to kind of problem solve. But as I understand it, like there's just it, and I think like the agencies that exist, I think they're really, really trying to do better. I know agencies that exist that do a lot of that work that are like being really deliberate about diversity and inclusion and anti-racist training. And I think that like, I think that as we're talking about systems, like systems need to change. We don't have what we need. That's not helpful.
I feel like this is part of like the whole point for defunding the police, right? Is to be able to take some of these funds from like just in time systems, right? So like police come in after all of the other systems have failed. After like you've got all of these systems that have broken. And that's like optimally they would come in after all of these systems have been broken, right? We're not talking about like the again, like their hobbies on the weekends, tear gassing people. But the idea is that like, if you can take money from this and put it towards prevention, maybe we don't even need to get to that point, right? And I feel like that's the whole point for so many of these systems. Like, oh, you want to have food help, right? Like you don't have enough money for food. You have to get so impoverished that like you can't possibly do anything else, and that makes it so much harder for you to climb back out, right? You need housing assistance. Oh, well, you have a car, that must mean that you're like rich. And so like you can't have that in order to be able to get a lot of the assistance that we need. And if we can just make it so that the systems that are supposed to be helping people are more robust, and allowing people to like get back on their feet before they're like buried up to their neck, then we would be able to do a lot more with those funds, because prevention is also like cost effective, right? Like it compounds. Like if you can prevent people from having to get to a place where they're so desperate, then that means that like you're preventing so much down the line as well, and also preventing so much trauma down the line that we also have to pay for. So
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that speaking of that problem solving piece, that's something that I think emerges out of this vacuum that we have right now in the lack of, you know, proper social services, proper I think societal responses to mental health issues. And you know, I think even things like mutual aid, which you know, can be a really great source of support, is primarily online based. And, you know, something that I think with COVID has been, you know, just not an accessible way of trying to direct people towards, I guess, like a community, like safety net of sorts. So I appreciate y'all's thoughts on it. Yeah, because, you know, as social workers, we have to deal with the haunting reality of knowing that that the folks that we serve, in particular, those folks who are Black, are just not getting the kind of support that they're needing. And it's, you know, something that I think about at night is, you know, is this person alive, or did they jump off of the bridge like they said they were going to? You know, that's, you know, a very heavy reality. And I think that one that, you know, we need to take that collective pain that we witness and that we experience too as empathetic individuals, and, you know, fight for defunding the police. So yeah, I appreciate y'all.
Thank you.
Discussion.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah.
GP, were you going to try to speak?
I'm going to try, but if I drop off, I will give up. Okay, so I'm going to be quick about it too. Oh, there you go. I lost it.
No, you're here.
Good? Okay. If you freeze, I'm afraid that my internet connection is frozen. No, there's one last question that I wanted to bring up to social workers specifically, since I have you all here, which is a question about the concept of worthiness and unworthiness, and how that plays into the connection between social work and policing. Oftentimes, individuals who sort of can't be helped, or who are perceived to be sort of unsavable, unsalvageable, are then system and left to policing as a kind of last resort.
Yeah. Do y'all have thoughts? I feel like I have thoughts on everything, so. Okay, y'all don't have thoughts. That's fine. Come off of mute. Tell us your thoughts.
So this idea of disposability is kind of what I'm hearing. And I think about this all the time, especially in the work that I do, and like who deserves care and who gets care, and I don't really have a ton of thoughts on it, except that you almost just made me cry. And like there is something about like who gets policing and who gets other services, right? I think that's what I was feeling, is like, are there people who don't deserve the kind of care that I would expect, right? That I have been socialized and trained to expect my entire life. And some people don't get that. Some people don't get to experience that because of race and class and gender identity and sexuality, right? Like, some people don't get the kind of like humanizing, restorative, transformative social work that I would like to be able to provide to the people who I am in service to. And I feel like that's a line in which, like, there's social work that I aspire to and social work that I think is actually more like policing. And so I don't really, but I think that question about disposability and humanity and about deservingness and dignity is kind of at the heart of all of this.
I agree. I feel like the idea of the deserving poor is like based in dehumanization, right? Like, some people deserve housing, other people deserve to have to live out on the street. And your character, and whether maybe you drink too much or whether you do drugs, is supposed to be able to determine that. And let me tell you, if I did not have a house to be able to come back and sleep in that was like remotely safe, do you think that I would be more likely to do drugs? Absolutely. If anybody needs to drink, it's the person that doesn't have a fucking roof over their head, right? Like, and so like we decide that there are these character flaws, and then we remove them from humanity, right? We're like, you don't deserve to be housed. And I mean, like in Austin, like, we literally treat animals better than we treat people without housing, like, especially if those people are Black. And I remember I would talk to Brian Oakes from the Equity Office, who I love dearly, and he would talk about how there was a department, or there was some organization that was so proud of themselves because there was a cat that was incontinent, and they flew that cat to Colorado so that that cat could have a surgery and no longer be incontinent. And then they flew that cat back here so that cat could have a happy life. And I was like, you all let people die on a regular basis, whole ass human beings, right? And like, you're so happy that you flew this cat to Colorado, right? And I'm not mad at the cat, like, so glad that you've got some help, right? But like, where are our priorities, and like, how is it that we are constantly giving people the messages that they are not worth, that they are not a part of the human race anymore, right? Like, that they're not worth our time or our effort or our energy. So yeah, those are some of my thoughts. JP, I know, so like we've got two people who have got their hands raised. Are y'all down for like two more questions and then to open out? Yeah? Yeah? Carrie Ann's like, I don't know, I might leave right now.
I'm good.
I feel like you've told me about food that you've had previously, and I feel like maybe that's what's calling your name.
Yeah.
Okay, Arash, we're gonna go ahead and bring you on.
Nikita, on the point that you just made about homelessness, our next episode of this conversation will be about policing, housing, and homelessness. So
okay,
that will be the next one, next Wednesday.
Sweet.
So
Arash, do you want to come on?
Sure. Can people hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. I mean, first, thanks to all of y'all for what you're doing and your work and your thoughts. I was inspired by JP's question about worthiness and unworthiness to kind of apply that to our profession and our identities in thinking about abolition. It made me think about how, they say, God give me the confidence of a mediocre white man. And it made me kind of think about police and how they advocate and how damn fucking self-righteous they are. Like, oh, I beat someone out and like I'm suspended. Like, now we're all gonna get blue flu and not show up to work because that was wrong. And it's just like how they skew the truth towards utter fucking violent, murderous delusion. And yet here we are as social workers and social services workers who, the NASW president, Angelo McLean, or I hope I'm saying his name right, can have an article in the midst of all of, what's been going on that talks about, how social workers collaborate with police, and that's a good thing. They make police jobs possible. Or NASW NYC that had a blog post about social workers being in police departments that was like kind of positive. And I feel like that has a lot to do with our self-worth. Like, we have to fight for the spirit of social work, because regardless of whether you think that we are professionals or not professionals or advocates or whatever, something in between, we're in a unique space where we are supposed to care about social justice. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to fight for a unified voice. We need to fight for the NASW to actually represent that. I feel like someone with the sensibilities of Angelo McLean should probably, I mean, if that article is representative of how he sees things, he shouldn't be in his position. And he should have been forced to resign by the professionals he represents. And I do feel like kind of we can be in this ideal place where we can fight for abolition as social workers, and we're called upon this in a way that's unique and particular and very specific to us. And if we can find our voice the way police do, and be as passionate as they are about their bullshit, except we're actually right, then I think that we can also find worth in ourselves, where we won't be gaslit by policymakers or some of those managers or whoever it is who kind of put us to relegate us as social workers to not really being able to define how decisions get made sometimes. So that's a lot of thoughts, and I'm very sorry about that if that was a little incoherent, but I hope it kind of connected or made sense.
No, I think that when you talk about abolition, I feel like I am also pro-abolition of social work, right? Like, I feel like if we're doing the right thing, we're working ourselves out of a job. Like, I want it to be the case where we don't need to have social workers anymore. And I feel like that abolition absolutely goes hand in hand with police abolition, and the idea that we don't need to have people with guns showing up for issues where, like, it's not helpful to have a person with a gun showing up, right? And that's not even, and that's without an anti-racist lens, right? Like, that's without the idea that, like, police kill Black people in large numbers. That's without the idea of, like, Botham Jean or Philando Castile or, like, George Floyd or Breonna, like, it's any number of people, right? And I feel like when I'm thinking about systems transformation, like, that's what I'm thinking of. Like, how do we make it so, like, we're not needed anymore? And that, like, community is able to take care of itself, and we don't have to come in like saviors, kind of like, we're going to save the day, or we're going to guide you through the system. Like, I want to make it so that you don't need somebody to guide you through the system. I want the system to be, like, here for you, right? And, like, if we can make it so that, like, I can go online and I can buy an item from Uganda and I can buy one from Russia and it's at my door in 4 days. Like, capitalism is actually a model where it's like, you know what? We want you to be able to do this thing, right? Like, I don't live in Russia, I don't speak Russian, but, like, I can get a product from Russia to my house in 2 days, and we can't build systems for people to be able to get food. Like, that's like from a grocery store that's like 2 blocks away. Like, we can't figure out how to be able to, like, get systems that, like, actually serve people. And so, like, we have models for, like, systems that will serve folks. And I feel like we don't think about those when we're like, hey, like, the systems that we have can actually be helpful for what it is that we're doing. I feel like abolition is absolutely the right way to go.
Nikia, usually I wouldn't add anything to what I just said, but you made me feel like I had to add something because you helped me process a little bit. Yeah. I feel like cops are in solidarity with each other because capitalism wanted them to be, and it was convenient for capitalism. And, like, the amount of solidarity that's there, it's honestly astonishing. And, like, what police unions can achieve in the legislature and everything they can do is because capitalism needed that. And I feel like the reason why, and perhaps people disagree that, with my idea that social workers are not nearly as much in solidarity with each other. I mean, we don't have a union. But I feel like the reason that we're not is because we're the most inconvenient profession to be in solidarity with each other for capitalism. So what is the power in us being in solidarity with each other as a profession? And I think there's something there for us. And like maybe a lot of change won't be achieved until we are. Like that is the how that one of the panelists kind of mentioned they were interested in.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's delicious. That is absolutely.
No, thank you so much. That was really wonderful. I'm going to be holding on to that for a little while.
Right? I think so.
Yeah.
All right, we've got one more person. We're going to bring you on, Patrick. That was so good. That was so good.
Yeah, just beautiful.
All right. Hello, Patrick.
Hello.
So I'm sorry, I was a bit late, so I'm not sure if this question is relevant or if y'all have addressed like particular organizations within Austin, but I lost what I typed up. In the Q&A, I talked about the program Longhorn Leaders, which operates out of the Steve Hicks School of Social Work group, school, and I'm an undergraduate, and I hadn't heard of this program for 4 years, and it's been running since the late 1990s, and is a partnership between the Greater Austin Crime Commission and APD, and like one professor, and nothing's ever posted about if it works, though it's claimed to be effective, and it seems like very DARE-like, like go into East Austin, and it was originally created to, as far as I can discern, like assuage or mitigate gang violence in the 1990s. And I was just wondering, like, this seems like a good example, like Arash was talking about, of like misplaced values from a social work institution in partnership with something like APD or the Greater Austin Crime Commission that specifically campaigns for higher police budgets and higher police presences in areas where like Mike Ramos was killed. And so it just feels like, I don't know, it's weird. It felt like I was going down a rabbit hole, but there's like no information about this. So I guess I just wanted to ask y'all's advice on like if you were a student at UT social work, how would you go about investigating this? Or if you know anything about it, is it a good program?
I will tell you, I've never heard of this program before, but it makes me think about the fact that, like, I don't believe for any single solitary second that police are interested, or that the system of policing is interested in decreasing gang violence. Like Fred Hampton is my hero, and Fred Hampton was in Chicago. He was one of the Panthers, and he very famously got like there to be a truce of gangs in Chicago, where like the gang violence stopped because they were like, you know what we need to do? We need to be fighting against white supremacy. And he was able to get a rainbow coalition started with the idea that like racism fucks all of us, capitalism fucks all of us, and like these police are the arms of the folks that are doing it. And that was such a threat to the establishment that they came through his house and they took out his pregnant wife and they shot him while he was sleeping. And it was such a gruesome display. Like it was clearly like an assassination that like his family had the house open so that people could see like all of the bullet holes. They slaughtered that man, right? And if you're interested in an end to gang violence, then you don't kill the person that's going to get that for you, right? If you're actually interested in it, like one of the things that ends gang violence is Black empowerment, Black liberation, right? Like if we don't have the trauma that's turned in on ourselves, like what is possible like what was possible with Fred Hampton, where like you've got these people who are in it to like for ride or die, right? And if that energy is turned outside to a threat that's not no longer in their community, right? That energy is all going towards like dismantling white supremacy, like that's huge, right? Like this is a community that's getting a sense of its own power. And I think that if that was actually something that was present in Austin, like I feel like APD would lose their mind. I'd be like, I mean, like if there was actually a real strong sense of like community empowerment in East Austin, before like to be able to combat the gentrification and all of the rest of the racist outcomes that are there. Like, I don't think that that's something that APD would actually encourage. Just real talk.
And I just want to jump in real quick and say policing programs like that absolutely speed gentrification and are actively a part of it. And when we're talking about homelessness and when we're talking about poverty, we have to be talking about how policing is a part of that, especially gang task forces. So yeah, across the country.
Cool. Thank you so much, Patrick. I wish that we can give you more information about your specific program, but
it looks like it's in the chat. Camille has sent a link and then a description.
Awesome. Thanks, Camille. Camille is dope. Thank you, Camille. All right, y'all. Do we have any closing thoughts for our participants today? And also thank y'all so much for being on with us for all of this time. We keep telling you that this is going to be an hour-long conversation, and we're clearly lying to you regularly. And so like we appreciate you just hanging out with us anyway. And I kind of told our panelists, I was like, hey, so this is an hour, but like if you want to stay on longer, that's cool. But what are y'all's closing thoughts so that people can take this away from this evening?
I wouldn't say like a closing thought in terms of like a nugget to walk away with, but I just really like, it seems like there's a lot of conversation about coalition building. And, you know, like all of these conversations, like obviously there's enough of us that land on the same page, that work within this work. We went in probably for somewhat similar reasons and thought and maybe had a vision of what social work looked like when we went into it, that like was a lot prettier and just. And I think we're all still in our minds, maybe delusionally, fighting towards the same things that we went in to be fighting for, and like don't want to just accept the status quo as being as it should. And so I really like the idea of, you know, it sounds like there's some stuff already existing in whatever way, like, you know, like I would love to, you know, Rachel, you were saying there was so much more in New York. I would love to you know, to join together with folks to see how we can, you know, outside of the work that we do in the day-to-day, improve upon systems, advocate for systems change, organize, all of that. So that's where I land. Will the chat be saved? Can I save the chat?
That's a great question. JP, do you
I can save it for there, saved.
Okay, great. Also, somebody's asking if this was recorded.
Definitely recorded.
It's
cool.
Yeah.
Carrie-Ann?
Yes, so my parting words is, I think just reflecting on the body of what we discussed here today, and I go back to the question when again, it's policing and social work and the temperature of defunding or reform police. I go back to the question, why was law enforcement created, right? And what are those parameters in which they were created? And then also, why was social work created? And so if we understand those two systems, why they were created, then I think we will have a better idea of how to dismantle some of the ideals of those systems, and then how we can stop being gatekeepers, but really work towards productivity for the human race. And what we can do, particularly for those individuals who are marginalized people, because I think that is who is adversely affected the most, right? When we talk about law enforcement and we talk about social work, is those individuals who lack resources. And so what can we do? What really is a solution? So that's like, we really start thinking, what are possible solutions? If no law enforcement, then what? And what would that world really look like? Is it feasible? And if it is feasible, then what are the next steps to make it happen? That's what I would leave it.
Thank you. It's dope.
So I'm not going to repeat either what Becca or Carrie Ann said, because I think it's perfect. And so the other thing that I'm thinking about right now is how can we use these institutions of social work schools as places to create better social workers, and how can we make the training itself better in the place where we're all together. So like in BSW programs and MSW programs, in like the professors that we bring in the curriculum we teach, and in the way we do field practice. It's nitty gritty stuff, but that's actually like, if we had like anti-racist trainings as a part of social work school, like what would that do to shift the conversation, Nakia? I mean, you know, it's a goal, right? Like what would it look like if this was a part of social work curriculum, so that every single student had at least the language to talk about, or like what is an anti-oppressive social work? So I think that's, you know, that's one of the things that I think about when I think about like, where do we go from here, and how do we kind of shift these conversations? And thank you for having it. I'm glad to have part of it.
My very quick parting thoughts, if my internet permits, is just that I love this conversation so much. I think that having a world without police means having a world where we do this a lot more, a world where we allow ourselves to imagine, to think outside, to think deep inside as well. And you know, I also want to say that, you know, the world without...
Oh no, JP.
The world, yeah.
No, do it.
The world without police isn't some distant hypothetical scenario. It really exists right now. It's a contemporary world. I think throughout the world there are, for instance, indigenous societies, people who have solutions that are not policing solutions to crisis. A world without police is not a world without crisis. It's not a world without pain, but it is a world with entirely different social responses to pain and different social responses to crisis. So I think that it's looking at that moment of crisis and asking ourselves, what would a different response look like? So I'm excited about this conversation, because for me, this is a step in that direction.
Yeah, awesome.
Without internet.
So I think my parting thoughts are about how, like, you can't talk about racism, or you can't talk about social work and policing without being able to talk about racism, and about how they're inherent in both of our systems. And I'm so excited that there are so many people that are willing to have that conversation right now, because it is so needed. Again, I feel like social workers have so much power at the crux of these systems. And it makes me really excited that people are exchanging information in chat. Like, please do that, do more of that. Like, I know that some of y'all have put your email addresses on there, but like, if we can get to the point where we're connecting and we're figuring out how to collaboratively like dismantle these systems, and also start collaboratively envisioning what a new world looks like, that's how we're going to get to it. And so I'm so thankful that y'all were willing to come in and like hang out with us for 2 hours. And I'm so thankful for the panelists for being willing to share their expertise and bring their lens, the very complex lenses to this discussion, to be able to share that with us. And I'm hoping that we can continue discussions like these going forward. So thank y'all. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nakia and JP.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.